Happy Sunday, and happy Father's Day to all of you who are celebrating. I have a strong and wonderful relationship with my father, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. But I want to pause at this moment and acknowledge that Father's Day is complicated for some of us. No parent is perfect, but some have caused harm that has not and may never be repaired. Some of us have lost fathers or grandfathers, or are watching their health deteriorate. And some fathers have lost children. Some men have lost the opportunity to become fathers. And they may carry grief on this day. If this is a difficult holiday for you, please know that you are not alone. This community embraces you and your whole story. Please pray with me. Loving God, Mother of all good gifts and Father of every kindness, enfold us today in your love that holds us fast through all life's challenges. May we hear no words but yours, spoken ever in love. Amen. I had the great privilege of being raised by a mother and father who were very intentional about their parenting and who chose to resist cultures of authoritarianism around them, both in past family systems and in faith communities around us. They chose not to be parents who ruled with an iron fist, but parents who took the emotional lives and the desires of their children seriously. They consistently created space for my brother and I to participate in family decision-making. When I was a young child, this meant that my parents taught my brother and I language for our body parts. They taught us about how to insist upon personal boundaries. They also helped us think about the big decisions that they were facing. Before my parents took positions as missionaries in Japan, when my brother was 4 and I was 8, my parents explained to us what that kind of move would mean. They helped us think about the changes that it would bring to our lives, and they gave us space to express our feelings about it, including my 5-year-old brother's fears about the volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunami in Japan. They told us later when we were older that if either of us had fears or reservations about that move that were inconsolable, they would not have made that move because they felt that our perception and our opinion of that move was part of how God was calling our whole family. All of us needed to be comfortable embracing that call. This decision on their part with their style of parenting became even more stark in my teens. When I was in high school, a series of unforeseeable events threw my whole family, but especially my parents, into a season of crisis. One of the events was a devastating earthquake in our city. My brother's childhood fears realized. One of the other events was the loss of a job opportunity that both my parents had deeply believed that God was calling them to. In this season, they experienced a profound crisis of faith. Now that I'm in my 40s myself, I realize it was also probably a midlife crisis. One of those normal seasons of adult life when you take stock and ask whether your life is what you want it to be at all. maybe for many of us, but certainly for those of us who are pastors and faith leaders, midlife crisis and faith crisis often arrive hand in hand. Because I was 15 and my father's office was in our home, there was no way for him to go through this crisis without me noticing. Not unlike COVID times, we were on top of each other all the time. And it was in this season, watching my parents struggle with their faith, hearing them wonder whether they had ever discerned God's call at all, hearing them ask whether moving to Japan 8 years before had been a huge mistake built on a massive delusion. It was in the midst of all of this crisis in their lives that I began to really talk to God in the real, honest sort of way, not the routine prayers that were rote and memorized, but really expressing how I felt, by which I mean yelling and crying a lot. Why don't you care that my parents are hurting so much? Why can't you just fix this and show them that you are with them, that it's all okay? Doesn't it matter to you that we are about to drown here? The cry of the disciples in our passage this morning is so human, so familiar. Teacher, does it not matter to you that we are about to drown? And the implied question, how can you sleep at a time like this? We need you. Some other translations say, don't you care that we are about to perish? I wonder if you have felt that cry come up from your heart and spill over your lips. God, don't you care that this is happening? This is the cry of anguish we hear from the lips of parents when online education is letting their kids down and they need better options. This is the cry of nurses who have watched patients die despite all of their best efforts when they now have to walk into the next patient's room to start it all over again with no break, no end in sight. This is the cry of each person who has lost income, lost housing, lost a loved one, and feels invisible in their desperate scramble to cope. This is the cry of those drowning in loneliness, sinking in depression, weighted down with anxiety. Don't you care? Doesn't this matter to you? In the gospel story, these desperate disciples wake Jesus from his nap. Jesus uses words alone to calm the elements of wind and water. And then he says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And you know what? That is my least favorite part of the story. I hate it. I want Jesus to console them. I want Jesus to empathize. I want Jesus to say that their fears and despair are natural and understandable, but it's all okay now. Have you still no faith? It feels like a rebuke, or the quiet resignation of a disappointed authority figure, which for this oldest child is worse than a rebuke. It's as if Jesus expected more of the disciples and they let him down. And I'm not sure what to make of it. I just don't like it. It doesn't square with the tenderness I have learned to expect from Jesus. And sometimes the Bible is like that. Sometimes we bump up against parts that feel extremely uncomfortable, and we sit with that discomfort. I am not comfortable with a disappointed Jesus. But there's another thing in this story that I really want us to notice. The disciples may not have displayed great faith in this moment. They may have failed the faith test. But did it stop Jesus from saving them? Did it stop him from calming the storm? Did Jesus wake up, throw his hands up in disgust and say, "You brought this on yourselves. You made your bed, now lie in it"? No. Jesus observed their fear and their anguish. He observed their lack of faith, and he loved them. He quieted the crisis. He saw them through the storm. Sometimes in the church, we make a big deal out of faith, out of trusting and believing that God is powerful, having faith that God is with us, having faith that God will give us all that we need. Heck, religious education at our church is called faith formation. We want more faith. We want our faith in God to be nurtured and strengthened and deepened. We want big, strong faith. But it turns out that the strength or depth or resilience of our faith does not change how God cares for us. Going through a faith crisis does not change God. It might change our experience of God. It might change our perception of God. But God remains the same. A band I listened to a lot in college has a song with a refrain, "My faith is like shifting sand, changed by every wave." My faith is like shifting sand, so I stand on grace. The grace of God, the love of God, the compassion of God, that rests beneath the surface of our lives like a steady foundation, regardless of how our faith shifts and sways, ebbs and flows. When I, at 15 years old, watched with dismay as my parents questioned their faith, I began to express all of my anger and sadness to God. And when I did that, I experienced God closer to me than ever before. I began reading parts of the Bible I'd never read before. I began having these weird intuitions that specific verses I had read would be meaningful to my father. And when I shared them with him, they were meaningful. It became a strange and holy time in which my father, in the midst of grief and despair, accepted small gifts of hope that I was able to offer. He affirmed to me that what I was offering him was from God, the very God he was so unsure of. And his willingness to receive from me, his ability to respect the ways that he saw God at work in my life, became some of the first seeds of my own call to ministry. But the biggest gift I carried out of that season was the way that my father modeled vulnerability. It shapes the way that I parent and the way that I pastor. I learned at the age of 15 that you don't have to have all the answers to be a parent who nurtures faith in the lives of their children. You do not have to be the one with the biggest, strongest, most unwavering faith to be the pastor. In fact, sometimes when we say, I don't know, or there is nothing I can do to make this situation better, that nothing, that gap that we cannot fill with our faith, is precisely where God enters to work in the life of the person before us with power that was unimagined. It is in that gap that sometimes the person before us is able to experience God calming the seas, quieting the storm. Beloved church, we have some rough seas still ahead of us. Figuring out how to reopen the church and begin gathering in person will not be easy. The process will feel excruciatingly slow to some of us and way too fast to others. There will be times when we reach out, eager to connect and see someone for the first time in person, and they will not be ready. There will be times when some of us yearn for more, and meanwhile others may already feel left behind. There might even still be times when the anguish we have felt over the last year and a half bubbles up again and spills over our lips as we wonder, God, do you not care? Does this not matter to you? So here is my request, or maybe invitation. Let's be gentle with ourselves. Let us be gentle with each other. Our faith in God, our faith in each other, Our faith in this process might waver, but the grace of God is sure. And Jesus is with us in this boat. None of our fears, none of our anguish, no lack of faith can actually prevent God's peace from prevailing in our midst. Amen. Amen.